The dense and sprawling forests of North America have always held secrets that refuse to be brought into the light of modern understanding. For centuries, indigenous people have whispered tales of a giant creature that dwells in the shadows of the ancient pines. This massive being is said to walk on two legs like a man, but possesses the brute strength and savage instincts of a wild beast. It is a legend that has terrified generations of hunters and trappers who dared to venture too far into the unknown wilderness. The sheer size of the United States offers vast stretches of untouched land where something massive could remain hidden from prying eyes. It is here, in the deep silence of the woods, that the legend of the Sasquatch begins. Many believe that the stories of this elusive ape-man are merely folklore designed to keep children from wandering too far from the safety of the village fire. However, the sheer consistency of the reports from credible witnesses suggests something far more tangible and terrifying walks the earth. From the mist-shrouded peaks of the Pacific Northwest to the dense swamps of the South, the descriptions remain chillingly consistent. Witnesses speak of a towering figure covered in dark matted hair, with eyes that glow with a predatory intelligence. The smell of the creature is often described as a noxious mix of rotting flesh and wet dog that lingers long after the beast has vanished. This is not a story of a simple animal, but of a monster that stalks the edge of human perception. One of the most chilling accounts in recorded history comes from the writings of Theodore Roosevelt within his book, The Wilderness Hunter. Roosevelt was a man of science and a seasoned outdoorsman who did not succumb easily to flights of fancy or superstition. Yet he recounted a story told to him by a weather-beaten trapper named Bauman, who had survived an encounter that left him permanently scarred by fear. The events took place in the rugged Bitterroot Mountains, dividing Idaho and Montana during the early years of the 19th century. Bauman and his partner had ventured into a particularly wild and lonely pass to trap beaver, unaware that they were stepping into the territory of something ancient and hostile. The two men were experienced frontiersmen who were accustomed to the hardships and dangers of life in the wild. They had faced grizzly bears and mountain lions without flinching. But the atmosphere of this specific valley unsettled them from the start. The air hung heavy and still in the canyon, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted and distant. Towering spruce trees blocked out much of the sunlight, creating a perpetual gloom that made every shadow appear to move. Bauman later recalled that he felt an immediate sense of being watched by unseen eyes from the moment they made camp. It was a primal intuition that warned him they were trespassing on land that did not welcome human visitors. They set up their camp in a small clearing near a rushing mountain stream where the water was cold and clear. The isolation was profound, nearest settlement being days of hard riding away through treacherous terrain as they went about the routine tasks of gathering wood and setting up their lean to the feeling of dread only intensified. It was not the fear of a known predator, but a creeping anxiety that settled in the pit of their stomachs. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks early in the afternoon, plunging the valley into a premature twilight. The darkness seemed to rush in from the tree line, eager to swallow their small circle of firelight. On their first day of trapping, the two men split up to cover more ground along the winding stream banks. Bauman moved cautiously through the underbrush, his rifle ready at his side. As he scanned the mud for tracks, he found plenty of signs of beaver and deer, but nothing that would explain the oppressive atmosphere of the canyon. However, when he returned to their campsite later that evening, he found their belongings scattered in disarray. The lean-to had been partially torn down, and their packs had been rifled through with savage force. It looked as though a whirlwind had passed through the small clearing. Yet nothing of value had been stolen. Bauman and his partner examined the scene with growing unease as they tried to determine what kind of animal could have caused such destruction. A bear would have torn into the food stores and left a mess of shredded supplies, but the food remained untouched. Instead, the intruder seemed to have acted out of pure malice or curiosity, rather than hunger. Then they saw the footprints pressed deep into the soft earth near the stream. They were massive impressions that looked disturbingly human in shape, but were far too large for any man. The tracks measured nearly 2 feet in length and showed the distinct outline of a bare foot with 5 toes spread wide. The discovery of the footprints silenced any conversation between the two men as the reality of their situation sank in. They realized that whatever had raided their camp was walking on 2 legs and possessed immense weight. The partner of Bauman began to voice his fears that they were being stalked by a creature of legend. He spoke of the stories he had heard from native guides about a spirit beast that resented the intrusion of man. Bauman tried to rationalize the situation by suggesting it might be a large bear with deformed paws, but his own words sounded hollow in the gathering dark. They rebuilt their shelter in silence and gathered extra wood for a large fire. That night, the forest was filled with sounds that kept them both wide awake and gripping their rifles. They heard the snapping of heavy branches in the distance, as if something large was moving deliberately through the timber. Occasionally, a low guttural sound drifted on the wind that was neither a growl nor a human voice. It was a sound of frustration and menace that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. The fire crackled and popped, casting long dancing shadows against the wall of trees that surrounded them. Every time a log shifted in the flames, both men jumped and peered into the consuming blackness beyond the light. Morning brought little relief as the pale light of dawn revealed that the creature had circled their camp throughout the night. Fresh tracks were found just beyond the edge of the firelight, forming a complete ring around their position. It was clear that the beast had been watching them for hours, waiting for the fire to die down. The realization that they were being actively hunted, rather than just observed, terrified the partner, who urged Bauman to leave immediately. But Bauman was a stubborn man who refused to abandon their valuable traps and the potential fur harvest. He insisted they check the traps one last time before packing up to leave the valley. They spent the morning checking their trap lines together, keeping their rifles ready, and constantly checking their backs. The woods felt even more hostile than the day before, with a palpable tension hanging in the air. Birds were silent, and the usual rustle of small animals was absent, leaving only the sound of their own boots crunching on the forest floor. They found several traps sprung, but empty, as if something had deliberately triggered them to deny them their catch. This display of intelligence was more frightening than any physical threat. It suggested that their adversary was capable of reasoning and understood the purpose of their equipment. By midday, they had gathered most of their traps and decided to return to camp to pack up the rest of their gear. The plan was to leave the valley before nightfall and put as many miles as possible between them and the creature. However, upon returning to the clearing, they found their camp destroyed once again. This time the destruction was even more violent, with heavy logs from the lean tossed aside like matchsticks. Their bedding was shredded, and their remaining supplies were stomped into the mud. It was a clear warning that their presence was no longer being tolerated. The footprints were everywhere, overlapping and chaotic, indicating a fit of rage. As they stood amidst the wreckage of their camp, a sudden noise from the dense thicket nearby made them freeze. It was the sound of a heavy body crashing through the brush, followed by a silence that was deafening. Bauman raised his rifle and fired a shot blindly into the trees, hoping to scare off the intruder. The report of the gun echoed loudly off the canyon walls, rolling away like thunder. For a moment, there was no response, and then a mournful howl erupted from the woods. It was a sound of sorrow and anger that chilled them to the bone. The creature was mocking them, letting them know that their weapons were of no concern. Panic began to set in for the partner, who was now trembling visibly and pleading to leave the gear behind. Bauman, however, felt a surge of defiance mixed with his fear and refused to run like a coward. He believed that with their rifles and a large fire, they could hold off any animal. They spent the remaining hours of daylight gathering a massive pile of firewood, creating a defensive perimeter. As the sun began to set, they lit the fire and sat back-to-back, weapons trained on the darkness. The shadows stretched long and distorted across the clearing, transforming the familiar trees into twisting monsters. The night was an ordeal of psychological torture. As the creature returned to torment them from the cover of darkness, they could hear it pacing just beyond the visual range of the firelight, its heavy footsteps thudding against the ground. At one point, a large rock was hurled from the darkness landing, with a crash just feet from where they sat. It was a display of tool use and dexterity that shattered Bauman's theory of a simple bear. They shouted into the dark and fired warning shots, but the creature simply moved to a new position and resumed its vigil. It was playing a game of cat and mouse, wearing them down with fear and exhaustion. Sleep was impossible as the hours dragged on with agonizing slowness, marked only by the movement of the stars overhead. Every rustle of a leaf or snap of a twig sounded like the approach of doom. Bauman recalled looking at his partner and seeing a face pale with terror and eyes wide with shock. They spoke little, conserving their energy for the attack they felt was inevitable. The fire was their only sanctuary, a fragile island of light in a sea of hostile darkness. As dawn approached, the sounds of the creature finally faded away, retreating back into the deep recesses of the forest. When the sun finally rose, it brought no comfort, only the grim realization that they had to leave immediately. They quickly packed what little gear they could salvage and prepared to hike out of the valley. However, they discovered that they had left a few valuable beaver traps in a pond some distance away. Bauman, unwilling to leave the expensive equipment behind, decided they should retrieve them before departing. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. They agreed that Bauman would go to the pond while his partner finished packing the horses. Bauman moved quickly through the forest, his senses on high alert. As he made his way to the beaver pond, the woods felt strangely empty, as if the creature had moved on or was sleeping after its night of harassment. He retrieved the traps without incident and hurried back towards the camp, eager to be gone. The walk back felt longer than the walk out, and a heavy feeling of dread settled over him. He shouted ahead to his partner as he neared the clearing, but received no answer. The silence that greeted him was heavy and ominous, suggesting that something was terribly wrong. Bursting into the clearing, Bauman stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The camp was deserted, and the fire had burned down to a pile of smoldering white ash. The horses were gone, having likely bolted in terror or been driven off. He called out his partner's name again and again, but his voice was swallowed by the immense silence of the canyon. He began to search the perimeter of the camp, looking for tracks or signs of a struggle. It did not take long for him to find what he was looking for near the edge of the spruce thicket. His partner lay sprawled on the ground in a twisted heap, his body broken and lifeless. Bauman rushed to his side, hoping for some sign of life, but the cold reality was immediately apparent. The man's neck had been broken with savage force, his head twisted at an unnatural angle. There were distinct marks on his throat that looked like the impressions of massive fingers. The ground around the body was churned up, indicating a violent but brief struggle. It appeared that the creature had ambushed him the moment Bauman had left the camp. Bauman recoiled in horror, stumbling back from the grisly scene as his mind struggled to comprehend the violence. But the horror was not over, for he noticed footprints leading away from the body. The tracks were the same massive prints they had seen before, but this time they were deep and spaced far apart. It seemed the creature had bounded away into the forest after killing the man. Bauman realized, with a jolt of terror, that the beast might still be nearby, watching him discover the body. He was now alone in the wilderness, with a monster that had tasted blood. Fear took complete control of Bauman, and he abandoned any thought of burying his friend or retrieving the gear. His only thought was survival, and the desperate need to escape the valley before nightfall trapped him there. He grabbed his rifle and a small pack of food, leaving everything else where it lay. He ran through the forest with a speed born of pure adrenaline, ignoring the branches that whipped his face. He did not stop to look back or listen for pursuing footsteps. He simply ran until his lungs burned. The journey out of the mountains was a blur of exhaustion and paranoia. As Bauman pushed himself to the limit, he rode the remaining horse, which he found grazing a few miles down the trail, pushing the animal to exhaustion. Every shadow looked like the beast, and every sound made him reach for his rifle. He did not camp that night, choosing, instead, to keep moving under the light of the moon. He felt as though the eyes of the creature were burning into his back, following him until he cleared the foothills. It was a flight from a nightmare that had become all too real. When Bauman finally reached civilization, he was a changed man, haggard and aged beyond his years. He told his story to anyone who would listen, but few could comprehend the terror he had faced. It was Theodore Roosevelt who eventually recorded the account, preserving it for history. Roosevelt noted the sincerity in the old trapper's voice and the haunted look in his eyes. To Roosevelt, this was not a tall tale told for entertainment, but a genuine account of a man who had looked into the face of the unknown. The story of Bauman stands as one of the most credible early accounts of the creature. The story of Bauman is not an isolated incident, but part of a dark tapestry of encounters that spans the continent. In 1924, a group of miners on Mount St. Helens reported a violent siege by ape-men. They claimed that giant hairy beasts bombarded their cabin with rocks and tried to break in throughout the night. This incident became known as the Battle of Ape Canyon, and it mirrors the Bauman account in disturbing ways. In both cases, the creatures showed aggression, intelligence, and a territorial nature. These were not chance encounters, but deliberate attacks. Skeptics argue that these stories are the result of hysteria misidentification of bears or tall tales told by lonely men. They point to the lack of physical evidence, such as bones or a carcass, as proof that the creature does not exist. However, for those who have experienced the phenomenon, the lack of a body is of little comfort. They argue that a creature this intelligent and elusive would know how to hide its dead. The forest is a vast and unforgiving place, capable of swallowing evidence and keeping its secrets well hidden. The absence of proof is not proof of absence, especially in the deep wilderness. The indigenous tribes of the Pacific Northwest have their own names for the creature, such as Sasquatch or Buckwas. To them, these beings are not animals, but another tribe of people who live on the fringes of the world. They are respected and feared, often seen as guardians of the forest, who punish those who disrespect nature. The legends speak of the creatures possessing supernatural abilities, such as the power to paralyze prey with sound. This aligns with the infrasound theory, where the creature uses low-frequency roar to disorient victims. It adds a layer of supernatural dread to an already terrifying biological entity. Modern science remains divided on the subject, with most refusing to acknowledge the possibility of a North American ape. Yet thousands of reports continue to flood in every year from credible witnesses, including police officers and park rangers. They describe the same massive figure, the same foul odor, and the same feeling of dread. Footprint casts have been analyzed by experts who claim the anatomy suggests a real biological creature. The dermal ridges and mid-tarsal break seen in the casts are difficult to fake convincingly. This suggests that something flesh and blood is indeed walking the forests. The psychological impact of such an encounter cannot be overstated, as it shatters the witness's understanding of the world. To see a myth come to life is to realize that safety is an illusion and that monsters are real. Many witnesses suffer from post-traumatic stress, similar to soldiers returning from war. They become afraid of the dark, refusing to enter the woods that they once loved. The Bauman story exemplifies this psychological toll, showing how a hardened frontiersman was broken by fear. It is a reminder that the human mind is fragile when potential death stares back from the shadows. There are theories that the creature may be a remnant population of Gigantopithecus, a giant prehistoric ape thought to be extinct. If such a creature migrated across the Bering Land Bridge, it could have survived in the vast forests of America. Evolution could have driven it to become nocturnal and highly elusive to avoid contact with humans. This would explain its bipedalism, its massive size, and its resemblance to both man and ape. It is a scientifically plausible explanation that makes the monster all the more real. It transforms the ghost story into a biological reality. But for those who hike the deep trails and camp in the remote valleys, the scientific explanation matters little. What matters is the feeling of being watched from the tree line when the sun goes down. What matters is the snap of a twig that sounds too heavy to be a deer. The wilderness is a place of beauty, but it is also a place of ancient danger. We build our cities and roads believing we have tamed the land, but the wild still holds the upper hand. In the deep dark, places the rules of civilization do not apply. The story of the elusive ape-man serves as a grim reminder of our own vulnerability in the face of nature. We are not the apex predators we believe ourselves to be when we step into their domain. There are things in the woods that are older, stronger, and far more savage than we can imagine. They watch us from the shadows, waiting for us to make a mistake or venture too far. The fear of the Sasquatch is the fear of the wild itself, manifesting in a form that mirrors our own. It is the dark reflection of humanity, stripped of civilization and mercy. As night falls over the Bitterroot Mountains, today the wind still howls through the canyons where Bauman lost his friend. Campers still report strange sounds, and the feeling of unease that drove the trappers to madness. The legend has not faded with time, but has only grown stronger with each new sighting. The creature remains out there somewhere in the vast green ocean of trees. It walks the ridges and valleys, a ghost of the wilderness that refuses to be caught. So the next time you find yourself alone in the woods and the silence becomes heavy, listen closely. Do not dismiss the snapping branch or the shadow that seems to move just out of sight. Remember the story of Bauman and the partner who never returned from the trap line. Respect the boundaries of the wild and never assume you are truly alone. For in the heart of the wilderness, the hunter can quickly become the hunted, and the elusive ape-man may be watching, waiting for the fire to die down. The mystery of Bigfoot is not just a quest for a hidden animal, but a journey into the darkest fears of the human psyche. It is a story that will likely never have a final ending, as long as there are forests left to explore. The creature exists in the twilight zone between myth and reality, haunting our collective imagination. It is the ultimate ghost story because it might just be true, and that possibility is what keeps us looking over our shoulder when we walk into the trees. The dread lingers long after the story is told, a cold whisper in the dark.